So, good evening, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for this live talk today with Dr. Emma Gowen from University of Manchester. So some of you might already be familiar with Emma's work at Autism at Manchester as the director of Autism at Manchester. And you would also remember that a couple of weeks ago, we actually had a blog introducing Autism at Manchester as one of our collaborators. So if you visit our website, you will be able to read a bit more about what they do and what Emma's role is in formation and direction of this important group, if you like. So just to give a brief idea to you all about Emma's background. So Emma is a senior lecturer currently at the Division of Neuroscience and Experimental Psychology at the University of Manchester. So Emma has completed her degree, her master's and her PhD at the University of Manchester, and then she moved to Birmingham to pursue her postdoctoral career, where she has actually developed interest into autism and autism studies. And mainly today, she's going to talk us about the motor coordination difficulties in autistic individuals. So Emma, thanks very much for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you finally. And I'm really looking forward to your talk, and I'm sure everyone else is as well. But before giving you the space to tell us about your work, I would like to introduce our audience briefly to our format, especially to those, I would like to introduce those who might be new to this live talk format. So first of all, Emma is going to tell us about her research within the first 35 to 40 minutes. After that, we're going to have a 10-minute break during which you can submit your questions using the right-hand side panel on our YouTube channel to submit your questions. And at the end of this 10-minute break, we're going to resume back this session, and I will be asking your questions on behalf of Emma. During which, again, if you want to follow up on Emma's answers, you can do so by submitting your questions. So Emma, so the stage is yours, the virtual stage is yours. And again, thanks very much for being with us today.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this evening. And so as Asa has said, I'm going to talk a little bit about motor coordination in autism. Now, firstly, I'm going to get you to do a little bit of work. So before you settle back and with your tea, coffee, or your wine, or your gin and tonic, your beverage of choice, I want you to have a think about 3 things that you might know about or associate with autism. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of time to think about that. Okay, so here we've got a word cloud, and this word cloud shows the different words and sentences that are associated with the diagnosis of autism. And so you can see different words such as social here, and repetitive interests. And some of these words you may have come up with yourself. So the bigger the word, the more times it is associated with the diagnosis of autism. So you might have already thought of some of those things. So autism is diagnosed with 2 main criteria, and it's diagnosed using generally some observational test batteries and questionnaires, which tend to be fairly subjective. And the 2 criteria, the first one is problems with social interaction and communication. So this might be problems with back and forth conversation. It might be problems with non-verbal communication as well. So, for example, difficulties with eye gaze, and also difficulties in making or understanding gestures. Now, the second criteria is repetitive and restricted behaviours. So, for example, making some autistic people like to have very fixed routines. So, some of you may have also written down or thought about movement difficulties as well, although I wonder how many of you, because these little words here, motor and movement, this is what I'm more interested in, and they tend to not feature particularly in the diagnosis of autism. And I want to show that I think they should feature a little bit more in this talk today. So firstly, what do I mean by coordination difficulties? So this is me tidying up after my son, which is something that happens quite a lot recently in lockdown. And you can see that I'm moving around, I'm walking, I'm coordinating my two arms, sometimes in the same way, sometimes in slightly different but complementary ways. I'm bending over, I'm balancing. All of those aspects are what I mean by motor coordination. So in today's talk, what I'm going to do is introduce you to me and the Body Eye Movement Lab. And they're going to talk a bit about motor coordination, so what it is, how we do it, and why it's important. And then I'm also going to talk about motor coordination specifically in autism, and actually what big gaps we have to fill in our knowledge around motor coordination. So firstly, a little bit about myself. So I've started, this is where I started my career, and this is where I am in the BEAM lab at the moment. I started with a degree in orthoptics at the University of Liverpool. So that's where you tend to work in hospitals and you treat and diagnose people with eye conditions such as lazy eyes or strabismus. I then carried on with the eye theme and did a master's at the University of Manchester on investigative ophthalmology and vision sciences. And here I did my project in the wet lab on corneal graft rejection. So no mention of autism as yet. I then decided that I preferred working with people rather than on in a wet lab with samples. And so I did my PhD at UMIST, which has since merged with the University of Manchester, where I was looking at how the brain controls our eye movements. And then I moved to the University of Birmingham, where I started my work in autism, looking at not just eye movements, but I started branching out towards understanding a little bit more about how the body works and how the body moves as well. And then from 2006, I moved to the University of Manchester to take up my current position, and I founded the Body Eye Movement Lab. So this really just shows you that my path hasn't been direct to get to where I am. I'd suggest it's more of a curvy path where I've had a number of different experiences in different fields. So the Body Eye Movement Lab, the BEAM lab, we have a number of different research themes. And one of these is autism in adulthood. There's a number of different topics that we are interested in autism in adulthood around here. But today I'm really going to just focus on one of those, and that is motor ability of autistic people. Now, as my work tends to focus on autistic adults, you'll notice that the talk does have a slight slant towards understanding motor coordination in autistic adults. However, some of it is certainly relevant for children as well. So these are the type of techniques that if you came to our lab, you might see. So we do things like focus groups and interviews with people to find out more about autism. Sometimes people will be watching things or videos or pictures on a computer screen while we record their eye movements, or sometimes track their hand movements as well. And we also asked people to make responses on a keyboard. And then in some of our research, we record brain activity as well. So moving on to motor coordination. What is it that I mean by motor coordination? So as I showed in the video of me clearing up, it's the control of different muscles to achieve a movement task. So that could be the control of muscles within the same limb, so the control of your fingers, or it could be the control of muscles and different limbs, so your two arms coordinating together, or your two arms and your two legs. And generally the brain will send out a motor command to those different limbs and then get some feedback through vision or through touch as to whether you've completed that movement correctly. And really, motor coordination is integral to pretty much everything that we do. So working together, building things, so building shelters, children playing together, eating and moving around and walking. Motor coordination is integral to all these different aspects. Now, many of us take motor control, motor coordination for granted. So it's a really key aspect that we think it's seamless. We don't really think much about how difficult it is. But actually, it's quite a complicated process. So I'm going to try and illustrate this a little bit with, if you try to think about how many steps you might use to make a cup of tea. Okay. So there's a disclaimer here in that I know there's many different ways to make tea, and some people get into quite heated arguments about the best ways of making tea. I'm only going to present one of those. There are other ways of making tea. So if you think about it, there are actually quite a few steps to making a cup of tea which will entail motor coordination. So first, you have to fill your kettle up. You then need to find a cup and select that cup. You need to find a tea bag, put the tea bag in the cup, and then pour the water in the cup. You need to find a spoon and take that tea bag out of the cup. And then you need to find the milk, pour the milk in, and you might also fancy a snack as well. So there's already quite a few steps that involve motor coordination in a relatively simple task, such as making a cup of tea. But each of these steps can be broken down further. So if we think about putting the tea bag in the cup, you need to actually find that tea bag. So you need to perhaps open a cupboard, reach inside the cupboard, select a tea bag, get it out of the tea bag box, put the tea bag in the cup. So within that, there was many steps as well involving motor coordination. You can see that in a simple task, we've got lots of different aspects of motor coordination. And I'd like to just explain a little and describe a little bit more about how our brains might go about performing a task, such as making a cup of tea, or in this case, picking up Lego. So, for example, picking up some Lego and putting it onto another Lego brick. So this is my brain. This is when I had my brain scanned in an fMRI scanner. And it's sliced down the middle. So this is my nose here. And this is the back of my brain. This is the top of my skull here and the top of my brain. And we've got the brain stem here, which goes down into your spinal column. And I'm going to go through how our brain might help our limbs to pick up, or my arm pick up a Lego brick. So first of all, we need to think about what it is we're picking up. So I would locate that Lego brick. I would select it based on my past knowledge of how to build a Lego house, perhaps. And I'd find that Lego brick using vision. So vision of that Lego brick is coming in through my eye here, and then it's moving to the back of the brain. This is your visual area where a lot of visual information is processed and made sense of. I also need to feel where my position of my hand is as well. So the felt position of my hand moves up from my arm, the nerves move up from my arm, up through the brainstem, a structure called the thalamus, and then into this area here, which is the somatosensory cortex, where your feeling of your body, the nervous impulses for feeling your body go. And then from that information, so vision of the Lego brick and the felt position of my hand, I can compute a plan to move my hand. So that plan is the distance and direction my hand must travel to reach the target. And that plan is computed in an area called the parietal cortex, just here. And that plan will vary depending on the object that I'm picking up. So for example, if I was picking up a smaller Lego brick, I would probably make a plan to move more slowly because it's harder to pick up a smaller object. Similarly, if I was picking up a very melted, squashy chocolate, I might actually plan to make a movement that when I picked up the chocolate, I was quite gentle and delicate with it. So I've made the plan, and that plan now needs to be sent via some nerves to the muscles in my arm. So that plan is sent to the motor cortex, which is here, which will then work out which muscles need to be activated. And then via the brainstem, those nerve impulses will be sent to my arm and then to the muscles in my arm, and my arm will start moving to pick the Lego brick up. So at this point, we need to make sure that that command and that plan is correct. So I need to monitor that my arm is going in the correct direction. If it isn't, I need to alter the speed, the direction that the hand is going, and also whether I've got the right grip size as well. And the way I can do that is, one way is vision. So I'm watching my hand, and that vision of my hand and the Lego brick is going back into my occipital cortex, my visual area, and it's being compared to the plan to see if everything's going okay. Now, if I just relied on a plan, if I just relied on vision, I would produce very jerky movements because waiting for that visual feedback is actually quite slow. So I'd move my hand, wait for the visual information to tell me if I'm correct, then move again. So I'd have very jerky movements. So our brains are quite clever in that they also use prediction. So here, that plan, even before the commands have gone out to the arm and the arm starts moving, my brain has made a prediction about what would happen if I made that plan, if I made that movement. And then it can compare it, that prediction, with the information that's coming in from the arm, excuse me, from the arm. So the sensory information, and it can compare that and see whether everything's going according to plan. If it isn't, that plan can be updated very quickly, and so consequently you produce nice smooth movements without too much error. So we can see that there's a number of different brain areas involved in a very generally simple action of picking up a Lego brick. And that's just the reaching component. I might be walking across the room to pick up that Lego brick, in which case you've got other coordination systems as well, such as your walking coordination system, but you've also got balance as well to make sure I don't trip over when I'm picking up something, a Lego brick from the floor, for instance. So it's there's lots of different brain areas involved in a relatively simple task. So, as I mentioned before, we generally don't think about this. We don't think about how complicated coordination is. But there are certain circumstances when we do notice how difficult motor coordination is. And that is, so one example is development. So when you're watching your children grow and learn different coordination skills, you start realizing how many years and how difficult it takes or difficult it is to learn these coordination skills. So for example, making very sort of simple finger and hand movements, or reaching and grasping to pick something up, or jumping, they tend to develop around 5 to 10 years of age, but actually continue developing to adult levels up until around 16, 17 years of age. So there's a number of years of developing those skills. Thinking about writing, which is an even more complex skill that can take until around 17 years to fully develop. So we can see how difficult it is to learn these things from how long it takes our children to learn them. Another time you might notice how difficult motor coordination is when you're performing or trying to learn a difficult task, a difficult motor task. So I've got the example here of a tennis stroke, a tennis serve, which is quite a complex stroke to learn. And people will take months, years to learn this properly. And then the final time when we notice how difficult coordination can be is when something goes wrong. So going back to my brain, we saw that there was a lot of different areas involved in just planning a very simple movement. And if something goes wrong with one of those areas, perhaps the area here that was involved in making the plan to move my hand, I might then find it very difficult to plan that movement and pick up anything. So that can happen in certain conditions such as a stroke, so a bleed in the brain, or in conditions such as Parkinson's disease, where people have problems in making movements, so they tend to be a bit slower when they make the movements, and also have a fair bit of tremor as well when they make the movements. So we can see that coordination is complex, and we can see it's used in many different areas of our life. And so consequently, those people who do have poorer coordination skills, there'll be a significant impact in certain areas of their lives. So for example, adults and children with something called developmental coordination disorder, or sometimes known as dyspraxia, so they have poorer coordination skills. Those coordination skills are often linked to things such as increased rates of depression and anxiety in both children and adults. They tend to have poorer quality of life, and more difficulties with daily living skills. So daily living skills mean things like using cutlery, walking around, and getting dressed, aspects like that. Another area for children with dyspraxia is that they often have poorer school achievement as well. So we can really see that having poorer coordination, motor coordination, can really impact on your life. Now, another area that coordination has more recently been seen to contribute to is social interaction and communication. So if we think about coordination ability, it's important to have good motor coordination if you're performing joint activities. So if we go back to my example of picking up the Lego, I might then pick up the Lego, then pass it to someone, in which case I would need reasonably good coordination skills to do that. And then here we've got the example of trying to move furniture with someone. In order to do a good job there, you need to, first of all, have pretty good coordination skills yourself, and then you need to coordinate with that other person too. And then more recently, it's been seen that our coordination system, our motor systems in our brain can actually really help interpret the actions of others. And this is called the perception action system. So for example, when you make a movement, so we've got this example here of a girl, she's dancing. So when she's dancing, there's certain areas of her brain that will be active to move her limbs. So just as you saw with my brain, my example there's certain areas that are involved in controlling our limbs. So these would be our motor areas involved in this case, dancing. Now, when she watches somebody dance, those same areas of her brain that she would use to perform that action are activated. So when we observe somebody else making movements, those movements are mapped onto the same areas of our brain that we would use to make those movements as well. And so consequently, it's thought that by our own parts of our brain being active when we observe others, and being it's the same areas we would use to make that movement, we can try and predict and interpret what other people are doing. So as an example, if you're sat facing somebody across a table, and it's quite a cluttered table, there's bottles and cups and plates, and the person opposite you reaches for one of those objects, by watching that person reach, and that reach activating your own areas of your brain that you would use to reach, that can help you predict what the person's going to pick up, and possibly you could then pass the object to them that they would like. So that's a recent development in seeing that how our motor systems can really help in understanding other people's actions. So moving on to autism. So you're probably thinking, oh, that's all well and good. I thought you were going to talk a little bit about autism, Emma. Well, moving on to that now. How is all this information that I've just given you about motor coordination relevant for autism? So as I mentioned, in the diagnostic criteria for autism, there's not really much mention of motor or movements or coordination in it. In fact, this is the main mention. So autistic people can display stereotyped or repetitive motor movements. So from that, you wouldn't really get that they might have coordination difficulties, because it doesn't really say that they have problems particularly with making movements. It's just that they're a bit repetitive. And actually this is contrary to a large amount of work that's now coming out that's indicating that around, or at least 80% of autistic individuals have motor coordination difficulties. So that's quite a large number. These coordination difficulties are present in very young children, and they continue through into adulthood, so they don't go away. And they're quite significant differences. So when you compare autistic and non-autistic individuals on a bunch of motor tasks, the differences between the groups are large, so very noticeable. And these coordination difficulties affect a range of movements. So we're talking about eye-hand coordination tasks, balance, and gait, so walking around, different walking patterns. And when I've talked to autistic people, they'll often express that they've had difficulties with things like trips and falls, driving, using cutlery, things like that. And in the lab, I just want to emphasize that even simple movements, so this pointing movement, which seems quite a simple movement, when we track, so you can see that there's a motion tracker attached to the finger of the person here. When we track those movements to look at things such as the size of the movement and the speed, we find that even with simple movements like this, autistic people tend to be a little less accurate and a little slower as well. As I mentioned before, motor coordination also seems to be important for social understanding as well. And so in autism, there does seem to be some link between social functioning and motor coordination as well. So, for example, autism diagnostic scores are linked with motor difficulties. So higher diagnostic scores seem to have people with higher diagnostic scores seem to have more motor difficulties. And then infants with who display motor coordination difficulties tend to be more likely to be diagnosed with autism as well. So some signs there that motor coordination might be having some bearing on social functioning as well. So we might think that as we know, as we can see that there's a large number of autistic people who have coordination difficulties, and we know that motor coordination can have an impact on people's lives, that we would be routinely measuring this in autistic people, and we'd have some idea about how to support autistic people for this. But actually, motor coordination difficulties are not routinely assessed in individuals with autism. And there's very little time or information given around how to improve these motor coordination difficulties. And part of this reason, I think, is because we've got some big gaps in our knowledge about motor coordination in autism. In order to increase the strength of the argument for people to be screened or to be assessed for motor coordination, we really need to fill in some of these gaps. So I'm going to go through some of these gaps in our knowledge now. There are other gaps. I've just chosen to focus on 4 of them. So the first one is this. Here we don't really know the impact of motor coordination difficulties on autistic individuals. So we know that autistic individuals have problems with or have worse daily living skills. So as I mentioned, daily living skills include things like eating, walking around, getting dressed. And we know that they have more problems in this area, but at the moment we don't know the contribution of motor coordination skills to this. We also know that they have difficulty, can have poorer balance. And if you've got poorer balance, you might be more likely to have falls. And as yet, we haven't really measured this in any particular way to test for this. I have began some consultation with autistic people about their motor coordination difficulties. And here are some quotes from some people that I've talked to. So this person says, cooking is difficult because I often cut, grate, burn myself and don't chop food efficiently, etc. Another person says, hanging out washing is hard because I often miss pegging something and or drop the peg and then have trouble picking it up again. And another person here talks more about balance. So regarding my balance in day-to-day life, an example of this being whenever I use the stairs, I always use the rail. And then finally, this person talks about falls in day-to-day life. This can happen if my attention is affected, for example. So we've got some beginning evidence there of autistic people talking about the impact of coordination difficulties on their daily lives. And this is a beginning. We really need to branch this out more and talk to more individuals, interview more individuals, or use focus groups to find out more information. Another aspect is we don't know the contribution of motor coordination skills to emotional well-being and quality of life. Again, we've got some inkling of this from autistic people themselves. So this is an autistic person talking about other autistic people he knows. So I know of cases of individuals who are in a permanent self-defense stance when out and about because of their tendency to bump into things. Repeatedly dropping objects and bumping into things can have a negative impact on a person's self-esteem, causing a poor self-image and sometimes leads to depression. So there's some understanding and linkage there between if you've got poorer coordination, motor coordination, this then has an impact on your quality of life and your mental health. The second area, the second gap that I want to raise is around physical activity. So we know physical activity is very important for aspects of health, such as your heart health, in your muscle and bone strength. If you've got poor motor coordination, it's likely to discourage you from taking part in physical activity, whether that's with other people or on your own. And so this again is an area we haven't really looked at. And if autistic people are finding motor coordination difficult, this may then lead to less physical activity, which can then lead to other health conditions. The third gap revolves around aging, so older autistic adults. Now, generally across autism, we know very little about how autistic people age and what particular issues are more relevant for them. And this is the same with motor coordination as well. So in the general population, we know as we get older, making movements is harder. We get slower and we get less accurate, and this has an impact on our ability to carry out tasks of daily life. And what I'd like to know is we've already got a gap between in motor coordination skills between autistic and non-autistic people. But does this gap widen with the aging process? And if so, we really need to know about it, because those autistic people are going to have an even more challenging time in older age. And this also has an implication for aspects of such as falls. So again, in the general population, we know that falls are the #1 cause of injury and death for elderly people. Now, if autistic people do have balance problems and do have a tendency to fall more, this obviously has great relevance for their own health in old adulthood. And then the final gap is around diagnosis. So specifically, can we use coordination difficulties to facilitate adult diagnosis? And this is something we've been doing a little bit of work on recently. So I'm going to expand on this 4th gap with you here. So at the moment, improving adult diagnosis is in the top 10 autism priorities. And this was a priority setting partnership set up by the research charity Autistica and a non-for-profit enterprise called the James Lind Alliance. And they asked autistic people, their families and clinicians and stakeholders, what were the relevant questions, research questions that they wanted answering, and improving adult diagnosis came in the top 10. Now, this is partly because the current ways that we diagnose adults aren't particularly well tested for adults. They were based in from children, and then currently haven't been what's called validated. So the accuracy hasn't been well proven in autistic adults. Also, autistic adults have been around for a long time compared to children. They've got used in some ways to having autism, and so developed compensatory strategies to try and get on with life and get on with other people around them. So they've had to try and change some of their behaviours and develop these compensatory strategies. And so consequently, that can then make it quite difficult for clinicians to be able to diagnose adults. And so consequently, it can lead to delays in diagnosis, which then leads to delays in autistic people gaining accessing support. So there's a autistic clinic, adult clinic that we work with, and they report waiting lists of up to 2 years. So we can see there's a big need here for improving adult diagnosis. So why am I focusing on the possibility of using coordination difficulties? So as I've mentioned, they occur in the majority of autistic individuals. They're present throughout life, so there's something that stays stable. And we can get some nice objective measurements, so we don't need to rely on people's opinions. We can use motion trackers to get movements from people's, to get information about people's movements, and in quite a lot of detail. And these motion trackers can be used in clinics as well. So this is what we've started doing in our research. So this is all in the lab at the moment. We've asked autistic and non-autistic people to watch an action and then copy that. It'd be just a simple sort of hand movement. Or we asked them to make some pointing movements. So again, those simple aiming movements. And while they're doing that, their movements are tracked by this motion tracker here, which measures things like the speed of the movement, the size of the movement, acceleration, jerkiness of the movement. And then we try and compare those different movement aspects between the autistic and non-autistic groups. Now, this is an example of the information that we can get out. So this is the movement progression. So this is the start, let's say this pointing movement here, and then this is the end. And this is the size of the movement in terms of the vertical elevation, so the height of the movement. And here in this particular case, the autistic group in blue were showing lower movements than the non-autistic group. It's the same with this one. We've got the start of the movement and the end of the movement here. And this is acceleration. So at the start of the movement, you need to make quite a fast acceleration to get your hand going. And autistic people here, in this case, were making a faster acceleration. And then at the end of the movement, when you need to slam the brakes on and decelerate, autistic people were making a larger deceleration here. So from our basic work, we tend to get differences between the groups. Now, what we do is we combine all that information about those different movement aspects of the size and the speed of the movement with a technique called machine learning. Now, machine learning sounds a bit scary, but it's actually something that's all around us at the moment. So if you have a subscription to Netflix, for instance, and it comes up with suggestions for what you might like to watch, this will be based on some machine learning programs that have looked at your previous things that you've watched and will kind of try to come up with a decision about what you might like to watch. Similar with sort of financial industries, so credit scores or looking for fraudulent transactions. There'll be machine learning programs that will be looking at your previous transactions to see to compute a credit score or to check for fraudulent transactions. So we're using it in a health setting here, which is often used in health settings too. And basically we've got all our different bits of data about the movement, and that's fed into the computer, which there'll be a number of different computer programs or algorithms that will then look for patterns in that data to see if there's any patterns that can distinguish autistic from non-autistic people, and then it will report who might be autistic and who might be non-autistic. Now, the key thing about using machine learning is once you've developed these pattern recognitions, these programs, you then want to feed them some new data. So you go away and you collect some new data for some new autistic and new non-autistic people. So they'd go away, we'd go away and get some more data of people pointing. And then we'd feed that into our computer programs and see how well, based on those programs that we've developed and that new data, how well it can detect whether someone's got autism or is non-autistic. And that gives us a classification accuracy, say 80%, 85%, etc. Now, the problem with previous work that's used machine learning in autism research is they often haven't done this important step of getting new data. So they'll test the programs on the training data. So the data that you've used to make those programs, they'll then test those programs on that same data. And the problem is that you can really overinflate your accuracy results. The reason previous work has done that is because we have a problem with working with clinical populations such as autism, in that you tend to have fewer numbers of participants. So going back to the case of machine learning in frauds detection, those programs will be built up over hundreds of different transactions over the past weeks and years. Whereas with autism, it can be harder to get the number of participants in. So one way is to retest your programs on your data that you've already trained. And the big problem, as I mentioned, is this overinflates the results. So for example, this is a graph that we created as part of our work. Each one of these dots here is a study that has used machine learning to detect autistic from non-autistic people. Not many of these are motor related research, most of them are imaging. And this is the number of samples, the number of people in those experiments. So we've got sort of fairly small ones to quite large ones here. And this is the accuracy of being able to detect whether somebody has autism or not. And we can see quite clearly that for the studies that have relatively small numbers of participants, they are showing very high classification accuracy results compared to these studies that have got much larger numbers. And that's really showing that there's a problem with overinflation here of those classification results. And so we've worked quite hard to create some very robust ways of doing machine learning, so some robust programs to try and overcome this problem of overinflating the results when you've got small numbers. And we've also used new test data as well. So we have tested our classification on a new set of participants. So these are the results that we had. So we've got 22 autistic and 22 non-autistic adults, so a relatively small sample size, who did the pointing and imitation tasks. So as I said, we created some quite robust programs to try and deal with the difficulty of having small numbers. And we also had new test data as well. And using that, we've got a pointing accuracy. So on the pointing task and the imitation task, a reasonably good accuracy of being able to detect whether a person has autism or not, of roughly 70%. So at this point in time, this is showing us that they're using motor coordination, so using movement aspects from simple movement tasks. Does look like it could be a promising tool for helping to diagnose autistic adults as a complementary aspect to the current diagnostic tests. However, this is very early stage work, so the next stage is we do need to test this on a much larger group of people and a more varied group of people, autistic people as well. So finally, I just want to sum up the talk. So hopefully you've got the idea that motor coordination is an integral part of our lives and is very complex. So it uses a number of different brain areas. Motor coordination difficulties are very common in autistic individuals, but despite this, there's a large number of gaps that we need to understand about motor coordination in autistic adults and indeed children as well, in order to try to get appropriate assessments and understand what kind of support we need for helping autistic people. So I'd just like to finish by saying thank you very much for listening. And if you want to find out more about our work, we've got our BEAM website, there's the Autism at Manchester website there as well. And obviously do email me if you've got any questions. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you, Emma. That was a very interesting talk, and I'm sure our audience has thoroughly enjoyed it as well. And it was quite stimulating. Some of the results that you have, I'm sure, will having intrigued some people. So now we're going to give a break for 10 minutes. So we will be back at 27 past. So hello, everyone. Welcome back. So Emma, again, thanks very much for that interesting and stimulating talk. So we have got some questions from our audience. But before moving on to that, if you do not mind, I would like to start a question that I have. So you talked about machine learning, you know, how you can use artificial intelligence to actually address some of the gaps that we see in autistic individuals with regards to movements. So how do you see this technology helping the patients in future?
So in regards to that specific example, it's about trying to improve the speed of diagnosis. So when I've talked to clinicians, they will have some cases where it's really difficult for them to make a decision about whether someone's got autism. This is particularly autistic adults here. And so they will need to have meetings to discuss that person, and that can take time. So the idea being with using the coordination and the combined with the machine learning programs would be to give a indication of whether that person is likely to have autism based on the coordination profile, and then that can feed into their decision and hopefully enable them to make that decision sooner, and so reduce waiting lists and get autistic people diagnosed quicker and more support.
Okay, great. So thanks very much for that answer. So I'm going to move on to one of our a question that was forwarded by one of our audience. So they're asking, as sleep disorders and sensory sensitivities are common in autistic people, is there any research currently looking into the impact of exhaustion and pain on motor coordination in autism?
That's a fantastic point, and as far as I know, no, another gap. So I'd certainly know, again from talking to autistic people, that fatigue seems to be a big aspect of some autistic people's lives. So that would be, yeah, very interesting to know about that. And the sensory aspect, that's something that I'm quite interested in, because I do think that problems with sensory input and perception, so as a lot of people know, autistic people have sensory issues. They might have hypersensitivity to certain lights or sounds in the environment. If the sensory and perceptual systems are not working so well, this is important to feed into the motor system, and so it may affect coordination as well. So that's certainly something that I'm trying to look at as well, how sensory aspects impact on motor coordination.
Great, great. So we will definitely look forward to hearing about your findings with regards to that. It's very interesting. So do you think the use of the machine learning could possibly increase the comorbidity of autism and dyspraxia diagnosis?
Wow, this is another really interesting question that I would like to answer. At this point in time, we don't know whether the coordination difficulties that autistic people have are DCD, developmental coordination disorder, or dyspraxia, or whether they are specific to autism. And that's going to be a key aspect of our work, using motion tracking and machine learning to really identify whether these are unique to autism, these coordination difficulties, or whether they are overlapping with other motor conditions such as dyspraxia or DCD.
Okay, all right, that's quite interesting. Thank you. So do you think then, just to follow on the theme of machine learning then, do you think the machine learning can actually be used to distinguish autism from, let's say, other similar, disorders within the spectrum, like dyspraxia?
Yeah, I guess that's the question. That is one of our research questions. So it's not necessarily the machine learning on its own either. It's the combination of using this very objective and quantitative approach of the motion tracking. So when you monitor someone's movement, we get out a lot of different movement parameters that you wouldn't get from just watching someone make a movement. So we've got loads of data, loads of movement information. And in order to make sense of that, you have to use things like machine learning to recognize the patterns. And so we're just using the very simple movements at the moment, the pointing movements, but we would like to use a variety of different movement tasks. So a bit around reaching and grasping, walking, balancing, to see whether, if you use a combination of tasks, whether that can help differentiate autism from things like dyspraxia, or whether actually they have fairly overlapping profiles and are the same thing. And I think that's what we need to do, is get more data on different movement tasks and autistic and groups with DCD without autism as well. And that will help us answer that question. So that is kind of one of our questions of our work as well.
Great, great. So it sounds like we will have to invite you back to actually find out about the outcomes of these questions that you're going to explore.
If I could get some funding for it.
I know that's always the case, isn't it? So I'm actually quite interested and intrigued about the use of machine learning, in autism, whether it's a diagnosis or any other use. So can you tell us a bit more about how you do train these softwares to actually, be smart enough to give you, to churn the information out and give you the outputs that you're looking for?
Yeah, so there's different stages to it, and as a caveat here, I rely quite a lot in a collaboration with some colleagues at Manchester who are experts on machine learning and artificial intelligence. So we work collaboratively together. But there's different stages to it. So one is called feature detection. So initially, we've got all this movement information, and we need to work out which movement information is the most relevant. So, there might be 100 different aspects of movement, and we can't use all of those in one go. We need to work out which of those movement features are the most relevant in being able to differentiate the groups. So once you've done that, you then do the classification algorithms, which are the pattern detection algorithms. And then you bring in your new group of participants and test it on those classification algorithms.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there's a number of different stages, which I've obviously glossed over here.
Great. So what would be quite interesting, though, we have got an artificial intelligence theme next year, or beyond September. So do you think you can actually put us in contact with your colleagues so that we can combine the loop and have them to tell us about how they use artificial intelligence in autism research?
Yeah, definitely. That sounds good.
Yeah, that would be quite interesting. Well, lovely. I think I'm just going to quickly check and ensure that I've covered all of the questions from our audience. Yes, I did. Well, thank you very much again, Emma, for this interesting and stimulating talk. It was an absolute pleasure to have you here. And I look forward to hosting you again in another one of these quite soon to see what your updates would be.
Brilliant. You're welcome. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.